The HR resolution letter called it an isolated payroll processing error that had been corrected. The Department of Labour investigation found a systematic pattern affecting 43 employees over 18 months. I'd worked as a production line supervisor at a manufacturing facility in Phoenix for 5 years. I managed shift schedules. I tracked productivity metrics. I approved time cards for my team of 12 workers. The wage discrepancy started appearing in February. My paychecks were short by $127 every 2 weeks. The amount was consistent, too consistent to be a random error. I'd filed an internal complaint with HR on March 8th. I'd documented the shortage. I'd provided my time card records showing hours worked versus hours paid. HR's response came on March 15th. Subject line, payroll issue, resolved. We've identified a processing error in your time card calculations. The discrepancy has been corrected. You will receive back pay in your next paycheck. This was an isolated incident. The back pay appeared on March 22nd, $254, 2 pay periods of shortages. But the underpayment continued. April showed the same $127 shortage, so did May. I filed another complaint on May 10th. HR's response was identical. Processing error, corrected, isolated incident. Then I filed a complaint with the Department of Labour on June 3rd. Their investigation found something HR had called isolated was actually systematic. 43 employees, 18 months. The same payroll error repeated across multiple supervisors and departments. My name is Michelle. I'd spent 5 years managing production teams and ensuring my workers were paid correctly for every hour they worked. Now I understood why so many of them had complained about paycheck shortages over the past year and a half. I opened my Department of Labour case file and started reviewing what the investigation had actually found. The Department of Labour investigation had taken 4 months. The investigator had requested complete payroll records for all supervisors and managers dating back 2 years. The company had provided the records in July. The investigator had analysed every time card, every paycheck, every overtime calculation. The preliminary findings arrived in my mailbox on October 15th. 43 employees affected, all in supervisory or lead positions, all experiencing the same pattern. Regular hours paid correctly, overtime hours systematically undercalculated. The shortage was always the same percentage, exactly 10% of overtime pay. For me, that translated to $127 every 2 weeks. I worked an average of 8.5 hours of overtime per week at time and a half. 10% of that overtime premium was $127. The pattern was identical across all 43 employees. Different schedules, different base pay rates, but the same 10% reduction in overtime premium. The Department of Labour investigators' report was detailed. The payroll system had been programmed to calculate overtime at 1.35 times base pay instead of 1.5 times base pay. The difference was exactly 10%. This wasn't a processing error. It was a systematic underpayment built into the payroll software. The investigators' preliminary conclusion: the evidence indicates intentional wage theft through systematic undercalculation of overtime premiums. The pattern affects multiple employees across 18 months, suggesting programmed payroll manipulation rather than isolated processing errors. I saved the report and documented everything I'd experienced since February. The $127 bi-weekly shortages, the 2 HR complaints dismissed as isolated errors, the temporary corrections that didn't prevent future underpayments, the pattern continuing even after HR claimed the issue was resolved. I didn't immediately share the Department of Labour findings with anyone at the company. I just continued my normal work and waited. The Department of Labour sent their official findings to the company on October 28th. I received a copy the same day. The findings stated that the company owed back wages to 43 employees. Total back pay? $287,000. The company had 30 days to submit a corrective action plan. 2 days later, on October 30th, I received a meeting invitation from the plant manager and the HR director, scheduled for November 2nd. Subject line: Payroll matter discussion. I accepted the meeting and prepared copies of all my documentation. The November 2nd meeting was held in the plant manager's office. The HR We've received notification from the Department of Labour regarding payroll calculations. We understand you officialed the complaint that triggered their investigation.
I nodded but didn't elaborate. The investigation found discrepancies in overtime calculations affecting multiple employees. The investigation found systematic wage theft affecting 43 employees over 18 months, I said. That's not a discrepancy, that's intentional underpayment. The plant manager spoke.
The payroll system had a configuration error. We're correcting it and providing back pay to affected employees.
The Department of Labour's report states the system was programmed to undercalculate overtime by exactly 10%. That's not a configuration error. That's intentional manipulation. The HR director shifted. We've been working with our payroll vendor to understand what happened. What happened is that 43 employees were systematically underpaid while HR dismissed every complaint as an isolated processing error. We corrected your payroll when you reported the issue. You corrected 2 pay periods. Then the underpayment continued. I filed a second complaint in May. You gave me the same response about an isolated error. But the Department of Labour found it affected 43 people over 18 months. The plant manager made notes.
We're preparing a response to the Department of Labour's findings. We'll be implementing corrective measures and issuing back pay.
The corrective measures should have been implemented after my first complaint in March. Instead, HR dismissed it and the underpayments continued for 8 more months.
The meeting ended without resolution.
I documented the conversation and returned to my work.
3 days later, on November 5th, I received another meeting invitation, this time from the company's legal counsel, scheduled for November 9th. I accepted and prepared my complete timeline. The November 9th meeting included the legal counsel, the plant manager, and me. The legal counsel was direct.
The Department of Labour investigation has created significant compliance issues for the company. We're working to resolve the wage violations and avoid penalties.
I waited.
We'd like to understand the timeline of your internal complaints before you filed with the Department of Labour.
I provided my documentation, my March 8th complaint, HR's March 15th response claiming an isolated error, the back pay that appeared and then stopped, my May 10th complaint, HR's identical response, the continuing underpayments through May. You filed with the Department of Labour on June 3rd. Yes, after 2 internal complaints were dismissed as isolated errors, despite the underpayments continuing.
Did you inform HR that you were filing an external complaint?
No. I'd already filed 2 internal complaints that were not addressed effectively. The Department of Labour complaint form doesn't require notifying the employer first. The legal counsel reviewed my documentation.
The Department of Labour is requiring $287,000 in back wages and is considering penalties for willful violations. If we can demonstrate this was unintentional, we may avoid the penalties. The systematic 10% reduction programmed into the payroll system doesn't support an unintentional violation claim. The payroll vendor may have made configuration errors. That doesn't explain why HR dismissed 43 complaints as isolated processing errors when the pattern was systematic. The legal counsel made extensive notes. We'll be conducting an internal review of HR's handling of payroll complaints. We may need additional documentation from you.
The meeting ended. I provided everything the legal counsel requested over the following week. My complaints, HR's responses, my time card records, my pay stubs showing the systematic shortages. On November 20th, the Department of Labour issued their final determination. The company had committed willful wage violations. Total penalties, $143,000 in addition to the $287,000 in back wages. The company had 60 days to pay or contest the findings. I received a copy of the determination and saved it with my other documentation. 2 weeks later, on December 4th, the HR director who had dismissed my complaints as isolated errors announced her resignation. Effective immediately, no details provided. I noted the announcement and continued my work.
On December 10th, I received notification that back wages would be distributed to all affected employees by December 15th. My back pay was calculated at $2,286 for 18 months of systematic underpayment. The payment appeared in my account on December 14th. On December 18th, the company's legal counsel sent an email to all affected employees. The company was implementing new payroll oversight procedures. All overtime calculations would be audited monthly. Employees could request detailed pay calculations at any time. I saved the email and monitored my paychecks carefully. January showed correct overtime calculations. So did February. The systematic 10% underpayment had stopped. In March, 1 year after my first internal complaint, I was called to a meeting with the new HR director. The new director was straightforward. I've reviewed the Department of Labour case and the internal complaint history. Your complaints were accurate and should have been investigated properly the first time. I nodded. We're revising our payroll complaint procedures. All wage complaints will now trigger immediate audits, not just corrections to individual paychecks. That would have identified the systematic problem in March instead of June. Exactly. I want to thank you for filing the external complaint. It identified a problem that affected 43 people and that our previous procedures failed to catch. I acknowledged the statement, but didn't elaborate. The meeting ended. I continued working as a production supervisor. My paychecks were correct. My team's paychecks were correct. The monthly audits confirmed that overtime calculations matched the legal requirements. 6 months after the Department of Labour settlement, I was promoted to production manager. The role included oversight of payroll verification for my department. I implemented additional checks. Every supervisor reviewed their team's overtime calculations weekly. Any discrepancy triggered an immediate audit. We never had another systematic underpayment issue. A year after the Department of Labour case closed, I was managing production operations for 2 shifts, 60 employees, all paid correctly for every hour worked. 2 years later, I was promoted to operations manager. I oversaw production, scheduling, and payroll verification for the entire facility. The payroll oversight procedures I'd helped develop were now standard across all company facilities. Monthly audits, employee access to detailed pay calculations, immediate investigation of any reported discrepancy. 3 years after my first internal complaint was dismissed as an isolated error, I still had all the documentation. My March and May complaints to HR. HR's identical responses claiming isolated processing errors. My June complaint to the Department of Labour. The investigation findings showing 43 employees systematically underpaid over 18 months. Those documents had proven what HR had called isolated was actually systematic. And what HR had called a processing error was actually programmed wage theft. The Department of Labour had reached that conclusion through their investigation. The $287,000 in back wages and $143,000 in penalties had confirmed it. Everything after that had been about building systems that caught payroll problems immediately, instead of dismissing complaints and hoping employees wouldn't notice the pattern. The HR director who dismissed my complaints had thought she could resolve a systematic wage theft issue by fixing individual paychecks and calling it an isolated error. The Department of Labour investigation had made that impossible, because once they'd analysed the complete payroll data, the 10% systematic underpayment affecting 43 employees over 18 months was too clear to characterise as random processing mistakes. That hadn't recovered the 18 months of underpayments immediately, but it had established that when HR dismisses employee complaints without investigation, and when those employees file with regulatory agencies instead, the agencies tend to find patterns that individual complaint responses were designed to hide. The new payroll oversight system was built on that lesson. Audit the pattern, not just the individual complaint. Because systematic problems don't fix themselves when you only correct one person's paycheck and claim it was an isolated error.